Well, the book is called Righteous Republic, The Political Foundations of Modern India, and it explores the vision of five sort of founding figures who helped create the Republic of India. So it's a history of ideas through the writings of Mahatma Gandhi, Rabindranath Tagore, Abanindranath Tagore, the painter and the father of modern Indian art, Jawaharlal Nehru, and B.R. Ambedkar, Dr. Ambedkar. And I look at how each one of them engaged with the past, with classical texts and traditions to try to fashion, a new republic. And so the word righteous in the title actually refers to the various norms and values and ideals that the founders had when trying to imagine, what India would be in the future as a free country. And I look at foundations in the sense of a groundwork of ideas that helped to imagine and ultimately produce a new kind of political entity from an India that was colonized and subjugated by the British Empire. Well, yeah, I mean, I actually draw on, not just ideas that have to do directly with politics or with the state or even with power. In fact, I look at, a range of different kinds of ideas to do with the arts, to do with aesthetics, to do with religion, to do with architecture. So, for example, in the case of Abanindranath Tagore, I look at a particular set of paintings that he made which show the Taj Mahal, or the Emperor Shah Jahan in the process of imagining and building the Taj Mahal, and then finally Shah Jahan on his deathbed taking a last look at the Taj Mahal. And I try to read those paintings for what I see is their a sort of larger place in Abanindranath's thought, where I try to argue that they convey a sense of aesthetic shock that that for the first time the modern Indian sensibility realizes that it is possible to conceive of some such thing as Indian art, right? And that Indian art has its own forms, that it has its own history, that it has its own traditions, and that all of the various things that we now are very familiar with, the Mughal miniature, the Rajput miniature, the Buddhist cave paintings, all these different styles and periods of art that we think of as being perfectly well a part of our history. For the first time, really, in the early 20th century, during the Bengal Renaissance, in Calcutta and Shanti Niketan, the Tagores and their disciples and their friends and their colleagues were making it possible to speak in terms of an art that was properly Indian. And that really, made a great difference to the entire climate of cultural nationalism at the time in Bengal, but also in the rest of India. And so it's in that sense that, I try to suggest that, it's not really possible to imagine a modern nation state which doesn't have its own sense of its aesthetic traditions and its identity as a producer and a consumer of various forms of art, of architecture, of aesthetics, sculpture, music, and so on. So Abanindranath Tagore acts, in my book as the figure that opens the door to that entire range of questions to do with art and the nation. No, I mean it's a book, and there's a very long introduction that lays out the argument of the book, where I say that if we think of the political movements of, let's say, the period between the 1880s and independence, or 1950, we always think of them as being, the struggle for political independence, the nationalist movement, the national movement, the anti-colonial struggles, right? And the dominant kind of category or frame in which we understand that is Swaraj, right? Swaraj, of course, means self-rule, but most of our history is written as a history of India's search for its own sovereignty, right? Which is the Raj part of Swaraj. But we don't really have any kind of good account of the search for the self, the Swa in Swaraj, which is going along with, which is concomitant with the search for sovereignty. Right? So there's a political quest, but there's also another deeper quest, which tries to answer the question, whose sovereignty are we seeking, right? Self-rule is the rule of whom, by whom, over whom, that self has not been defined, and in order to define that self, all of the people involved in this period, in the intellectual churning of this period, many of them think very carefully about the relationship between the point in time where they are and the past, and traditions of thought and of knowledge and of the arts and so on, which are available within the region, within the subcontinent, and they try to actively engage with all of that, because most of what we know about India's quest for freedom looks at the fact that political freedom, that is to say political independence from British rule, Swaraj versus British Raj, most of that history looks at the fact that most of our freedom fighters and founding fathers were highly anglicized, highly westernized, English speaking, educated in England, and ultimately the ideas that they took from Western, liberal thought, Marxism, the Western democracies, England, France, America, and so on. These are the ideas that they translated into the architecture of the new nation state, right? So that's how we got democracy and federalism and a republic and a constitution and values like liberty and equality and fraternity and citizenship and the vote and so on. But at the same time, right, that account of models of sovereignty is an account of what India derived from the West, what Indians learned from or took from their encounter with the West through colonialism. But Indians were also rooted in their own context and also embedded in their own social and cultural milieu, and well aware of their own sort of past as well as their continuing traditions, in which, when we say traditions, we mean traditions of political thought, traditions also of a cultural and social and economic nature, literary traditions and so on. Those were also the surround in which all of this quest was unfolding. So I try to provide an account of, we already know what we learned from the West, but what is it that we also absorbed from, took from, and changed about what was our own, right? And how did that feed into the creation of this kind of new thing that India was going to be, and to what extent, did it not also? I mean, many of those were roads not taken. So that is also something we need to be aware of. I have an introduction and I have a conclusion, and then there are 5 chapters, each of which focuses on a different thinker, leader, founder, and looks at the categories of thought that emerge from their particular conversation, between tradition and modernity. Well, I wanted to suggest that, in imagining a new India or a free India, the impulse on the part of most of the founders was, to create the most capacious, the most accommodating, the most tolerant, the most plural, the most free nation imaginable, right? There was an aspiration, right, towards very high values, towards ethical forms of sovereignty. So, it's not that they were trying to create a totalitarian state, right, or a state which would deny rights to the people, or which would suppress or exclude certain communities, or oppress certain sections, right? They were actually trying to think, how do we keep the best of what we've had, and the best of what we've taken from the rest of the world, and create really something which is the best possible form, of a political nature, and it's that kind of aspiration towards the normative and the ethical that I try to indicate through the word righteous, right? I mean, this was not a quick and dirty exercise. It was not intended to be short term. It was not sectarian. It was not designed to exclude. So in that sense, it was a pretty idealistic endeavor. Now, not every ideal that was imagined or thought about was realized, and certainly the post-colonial state has let Indians down in many ways, and we all know that it has many problems. But I found that a lot of the thought of the founders really had this tendency towards thinking about the future in a very constructive and positive way, and that's what I want to indicate through the word righteous. In fact, actually, almost all these figures have a very interesting and complicated relationship to the ultimate goal of Indian self-rule or sovereignty. So, for example, and I mean, this is the subject of the book. This is what I discuss in the book. That for Gandhi, the greatest value was ahimsa, right? Was to remove violence from the relation between self and other. He's considered the father of the nation. He's considered the leader of the national movement. He was the biggest leader of his times, from about 1920 to his death in 1948. He loomed larger than anybody else. So how is it that his central concern was with non-violence, and we ended up having such a violent partition, which was also at the exact moment the founding of India and Pakistan. There's something counterintuitive about that, about trying to engage in a modern political project which puts non-violence at its heart, right? Similarly with Tagore. Tagore was completely against Rabindranath. He was against nationalism and the nation state, and he wrote about this, and he lectured about this, and yet he's considered our national poet, and he is the author of the songs which became the national anthems of both India and Bangladesh in 1971. And he, was against modern forms of violence, of territoriality, of state building, and so on, right? But again, when we conceive of our founding, we think of him as being a central figure, right? Despite his direct opposition to the actual business of state building. Abanindranath, as you correctly pointed out, was a painter. He was not a politician, right? But his image, the first image of Bharat Mata, of Mother India, is a painting that Abanindranath made during the Swadeshi movement in the early part of the 20th century. So something about his conception of the nation as mother remained as an image, and a very powerful image that guided a lot of nationalist and patriotic politics, right up to independence. So Nehru and Ambedkar are different than these other three, in the sense that Nehru actually made the transition from being a nationalist to being a post-colonial administrator and actually governing free India after it was created as such. And in his case, I look at how he chose the national symbols. And why did he choose an entire set of symbols from the Mauryan Empire and from the Ashokan period? What was it about the figure of Ashoka that appealed to Nehru? Ambedkar's puzzle is also, something to be considered, because, as you know, he was on a different path. He had a different struggle, which was to annihilate the caste system, to free India from untouchability, to integrate different caste communities into the mainstream, the national mainstream, to fight for fundamental rights and the basic dignities of all communities and all castes. And in this struggle, he was often, somewhat apart from, let's say, the Indian National Congress and other leaders. And Ambedkar was very modern in his outlook and thinking and appearance and dress and language and so on. And as you know, he helped to draft the constitution, he presided over the drafting committee and so on. But at the very end of his life, in the last months of his life, he converted to Buddhism. And this is a puzzling thing, why does he turn to religion at the end? After rejecting religion, after rejecting all forms of tradition and traditional forms of social organization, and questioning those because of the inequality that is inherent in them, he ultimately decides that the political identity of former untouchables is going to come from a religious system, which is Buddhism, right? So there's a kind of reconciliation, you could say, or a turn towards tradition. That's one way to read the conversion of Ambedkar to Buddhism. But it goes against the grain of everything in the previous 5 decades of his life. So to try to understand all these things, one has to look very carefully at why it is that our founding figures, our greatest sort of heroes, our most sort of revered political leaders and thinkers from that early first half of the 20th century, why all of them have a tangential relationship to, the brute facts of power and the realities of state building, which are violent, which make all kinds of compromises with values, which are concerned with militaristic and territorial forms of power and so on, right? In a sense, you have a bunch of very idealistic people who are involved in the making of our nation, and that is both, it's our strength, because it provides a kind of moral center to our nationhood, but it's also something that we have to preserve very carefully, and which we seem to be losing out on in our present day politics. When that is, those kinds of aspirations are not necessarily reflected in the way we actually go about our political lives nowadays. It took me 4 years to research and write it, and then 1 more year to take it to press and the sort of proofreading, editing, all that, the production process. So altogether 5 years.